Hi everybody, welcome to a recorded lecture. Today we are in period 8 and actually episode 8. Today we're going to talk about the triumph of conservatism. Today is the final day, the final lecture of period 8 of Post-Modernity. This is actually also the last period that we even try to do lectures in. After this, when we get to period 9, we'll kind of just sort of catch things up with a discussion and a handful of videos. So this is the final organized lecture of the school year of your APUSH career. So enjoy it, savor these moments. So today we actually go beyond the boundaries of what is episode or period 8. Period 8 is supposed to run up through the year 1980, and we're actually going to take the storyline up through 1992 today, up through the first or through George H.W. Bush's presidency. And the reason that we do that is because it allows us to finish some storylines, kind of tie up some loose ends and some pieces and put them into place. So we'll go a little bit beyond whatever be the conventional idea of period 8 today, and I think it'll make sense when we get there. So we have 5 objectives, 6 objectives. Boy, that's a lot. By the end of class, you should be able to summarize Gerald Ford's efforts to confront economic problems and to handle foreign policy. You should be able to outline the major events of the Carter administration. You should be able to explain the roots and rise of conservatism in the 1970s. You should be able to summarize Ronald Reagan's domestic policy, summarize his foreign policy, and discuss George H.W. Bush's election. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 22. You'll remember, of course, that Ford took office as an unelected president. He was appointed to take the position of Spiro Agnew in the Nixon administration, and then, well, when Nixon resigned, Ford became the president, and he's the only president to not win an election to get there. So he takes office, and he immediately knows that he's not in a position of, I don't know, political strength, and he quips about it, that he's a Ford, not a Lincoln. But he declared the long national nightmare is over and pardoned Nixon about a month after Nixon resigned. Ford hoped to move past Watergate, but it did have huge political costs for him and probably ended his political career. In domestic policy, Ford's presidency lacked any significant accomplishment. In terms of domestic policy, he tried to he's still plagued with the same economic problems, which dogged the Nixon administration. It doesn't get any better with Ford taking over the helm. His main policy focus was to slow inflation, which felt like it was on a runaway path. It had surged from 6% inflation to 10% inflation, mostly on the cost of gasoline and home heating oil, which we don't really use in the Kansas City area, but it's pretty common in other parts of the country. He tried to get a program together called Whip Inflation Now, or the WIN program. And it was a program of citizens trying to urge others to be energy efficient and also to cut back on oil and gas use. Ultimately, it was a failure of a program. It was no incentive to participate. It tried to get peer pressure to make a difference, and that just wasn't enough. He did try to take a monetary policy called tight money, a tight money program to cut spending. Well, it wasn't monetary policy, but it was an economic policy called tight money to cut spending and raise interest rates to restrict credit, and that would fight inflation that way. The result was the economy dogged, and it plunged into the worst recession since the time of the Great Depression. Now, Ford presided over what's known as a divided government. You'll learn more about this when you take AP Gov, but a divided government is when the legislature and the president are of different parties. So here you have a Republican president presiding over a Democratic Congress, and at least for Ford, it doesn't always, but for Ford, it made a certain amount of gridlock where Democrats in Congress had an economic agenda, and Ford mostly refused that. He had over 50 vetoes in his very brief presidency, which is quite a bit for the amount of time that he had in office. In terms of foreign policies, he made a couple of important moves. One of the key pieces, I think, was that he retained Henry Kissinger as the Secretary of State. He continued to try to negotiate with both China and the Soviet Union, trying to stay relevant in the world community. He signed what's known as the Helsinki Accords. Helsinki Accords pledged cooperation between Eastern and Western Europe, and it tried to. So the Eastern and Western Europe divide was, it's geographical, it's cultural, it's also largely political. That Eastern Europe was communist and Western Europe was not. So the Helsinki Accords tried to bridge the communist and Western worlds together. In 1975, the ceasefire in Vietnam broke down, and Ford asked Congress for $722 million to aid South Vietnam. Congress ultimately refused, and Saigon fell. About the same time, Cambodia seized a merchant ship. So Cambodia, which you'll remember we destabilized in part of our pull out of South Vietnam. But Cambodia seized a U.S. merchant ship in the Gulf of Siam, which today we call the Gulf of Thailand, and Ford responded with basically a huge military response. He rescued the crew of 39, but to do so, he lost 41 servicemen in the effort. And that is a sad but kind of typical thing that would have happened with the Ford administration. The gains came at huge costs. Ford's unpopularity ultimately brought a 1976 primary challenge from then former governor of California, Ronald Reagan. Now, Reagan didn't win the primary, but he left Republicans really divided over Ford's leadership. Sitting presidents of a party very rarely have a challenge, an inter-party challenge like in the primary. That doesn't happen very often, that some Republican is the president and come the next election some other Republican challenges him. That doesn't happen very often, but it did happen in 1976, and because Ford was a weak leader. And I think the primary challenge from Reagan didn't win it. Ford was able to survive the primary challenge, but it did show that he was a weak leader. Democrats mused that we could run an aardvark this year and win, and that's what an aardvark is right there. You ever see the TV show Arthur? He's an aardvark. I don't know why it doesn't look anything like an aardvark. Roman numeral number 13, the aardvark. Jimmy Carter was the governor of Georgia, and he was a soft-spoken, mostly unknown peanut farmer. He made a virtue of the fact that he'd never held federal office. In a time that people didn't trust their government, being an outsider seemed like a huge advantage. He promised to restore presidential integrity. He said, "I will never tell a lie to the American people," and that, Americans were hungry of that after the years of the Nixon administration, where people just felt like they couldn't trust their government anymore. But not just the Nixon administration. The Pentagon Papers had shown that there had been deception through a number of presidents in a row. Carter and Ford debated approaches to real issues like energy, inflation, unemployment. These were, I think today a type of political discourse that we're just not used to anymore. It was boring and technical. It was about policy, not showmanship. And there's a certain segment of Americans that I think that are pretty hungry to make politics boring again. Carter won. Ford was a career politician, and this was the time that it was an election where voters really wanted an outsider. Career politicians just didn't seem to make sense anymore. Carter was down to earth. He had these fireside chats on TV. He had a soft-spoken Southern drawl, and he did just seem approachable, like the kind of guy that you could, sit down and talk to. He was not skilled with Congress, though. I think being a political outsider, he was governor of Georgia, but largely a political outsider, was pretty much unsuited to deal with Washington, and I think it showed up pretty fast. He alienated fellow Democrats. He had strong opposition from both parties and was largely unable to get budget, tax, or welfare programs through Congress. Carter believed that human rights should be the center of foreign policy. Presidents every now and then come along who just really say that they're going to commit themselves to doing the right thing in the world, and that's a noble goal. It doesn't always turn out for them very well, but with Carter, human rights became the center of foreign policy. It's a powerful idea, but one of the biggest problems is that no one agrees what are the human rights, what rights are universal to being a human. So Carter insisted that foreign policy can't be separated from the big issues of justice and equality and human rights, and those things matter, and you can't just separate them out and make everything realpolitik and the strongest ones matter and everybody else doesn't. So organizations like Amnesty International and the International League for Human Rights, they were non-governmental organizations, but they had a large role that they played in affecting how Jimmy Carter thought of the world. And even though they were not government agencies, they ended up having a pretty important voice in the government. Now, in Latin America in particular, he wanted to come out and say, to have a strong moral position. Carter cut off aid to Argentina. Argentina was in a civil war known as the Dirty War between the nationalists and the socialists. And there wasn't any clear good or bad side. Both sides looked bad and both sides somehow looked good in it as well. It's kind of an interesting piece of history for our own current pontiff. Pope Francis was in Argentina at the time of the Dirty War, and I think it really did shape the way that he looked at the world. Look it up on your own. It's not going to be, it's outside the scope of APUSH. But Carter cut off support also to Nicaragua's dictatorship. Nicaragua, the Central American country. That dictatorship was strongly anti-communist, which would traditionally get American support, but they were bad dudes, and that's not the way Carter thought. So he cut off the support to the Nicaraguan dictatorship as well. He signed a treaty to hand over the Panama Canal to Panama in 1999. So he's doing this in the 1970s, but he says in 1999, America will be totally finished with the Panama Canal, even though we built it and ran it and destabilized Colombia in order that Panama could become its own country, but whatever. Carter was the one that put the wheels in place to go turn over the Panama Canal to the Panamanians. He did take the long-term approach and signed it in the 70s, but said it wouldn't go into effect until 1999. It did. We no longer have control over the Panama Canal. One of the things I think that we can honestly say that while Carter was unsuccessful on a lot of fronts, one of the things that I think he did very well and deserves credit for are the Camp David Accords. The Camp David Accords were signed by Egypt and Israel in 1978. They were negotiated by Carter. They led to a peace between Egypt and Israel, and that's pretty important. But then in 1979, things get difficult. Here, the 1979 Iranian Revolution deposed its monarch, the Shah of Iran. The United States had bought oil and sold weapons to the Shah of Iran. The Shah was the monarch. He's basically the king of Iran, the Shah of Iran. He had dealt with the Shah. But the unpopular dictator, because he was not a pleasant person and was really running Iran, well, he was a monarch and doing all the stuff that you kind of hate about monarchs. He was replaced with a religious leader, this scary-looking dude up here at the top left, Ayatollah Khomeini. The Ayatollah Khomeini, was a religious leader. He was a Muslim leader and took over Iran and turned Iran into like a theologically Muslim-run country rather than having a Muslim monarch. Iranian revolutionaries, they were enraged when Carter allowed the Shah of Iran into the United States for medical treatment. So he had been deposed by the Ayatollah and had come to the United States for medical treatment, and that made Iranian revolutionaries crazy, and they wanted to go lash out against whatever Americans were in Iran at the time. And 52 hostages were taken from the United States Embassy in Tehran, which is the capital of Iran. The captors wanted Carter to return the Shah, but Carter refused. He says, no, I'm not going to send this guy back because you're just going to go kill him, and he's here for medical reasons. We're not sheltering him. The hostages were held for 444 days. They weren't released until Ronald Reagan had become president. It became the thing probably that dogged the Carter administration. Every night, the weekly, the nightly news, CBS nightly news would come on, and Walter Cronkite would say, "Today is day 238 of Americans held hostage." And that's the way he would refer to it, as Americans being held hostage in Iran. The Iranian Revolution marked a shift in opposition movements in the Middle East. They went from whether or not they were going to become socialist countries to whether or not they would become Arab nationalist countries to whether or not they would become religious fundamentalist countries. So like in the 1970s, beginning with Iran, it carried over from there that we no longer talked about communism in the Middle East, we talked about extremist Islam. Both conservative Cold Warriors and foreign policy realists severely criticized Carter's emphasis on human rights, and the United States continued to support dictatorships. Nevertheless, the United States supported dictatorships in Guatemala, the Philippines, and South Korea. Now, Carter on the economy is probably the thing that historians remember most about him. Carter saw inflation, not unemployment, as the main economic problem. In general, by the way, if you ever become president of the United States, and I kind of hope you don't, but if you do, ever become president of the United States, focus on jobs. Employment matters far more to people. But anyway, Carter saw inflation, not unemployment, as the main economic problem. He hoped to promote competition and drive down prices. Carter deregulated trucking and airline industries. He supported the Federal Reserve Bank's decision to raise interest rates. When they raise interest rates, that risks greater unemployment, but Carter was going after inflation more than he was interest rates, or more than he was unemployment. The Middle Eastern trouble kept the prices high, though, and they probably couldn't really tackle inflation until they got oil prices under line. Overall, the inflation rate did not fall. By the year 1980, inflation was 14%. That's crazy high. That's like crisis level high, with major impacts to the United States standard of living. So if energy is the problem here, let's talk about energy. Well, one of the problems was Carter promoted the expanded use of nuclear energy to reduce the rate of imported oil dependency. Nuclear energy is clean, it's relatively inexpensive. However, so in 1978, over 200 nuclear plants were operating or coming online. By the end of the 1970s, the nuclear power looked like the energy of the future. Because run correctly, it's safe, it's essentially emissionless, and run correctly, it's a really ideal way to produce electricity. But then in 1979, a nuclear reactor at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, it's an island on the river, in 3 Mile Island nuclear reactor partially overheated, and it released some radioactive steam. All of the security pieces went into place. The reactor did not melt down. Everything happened according as it should. It did release some radioactive steam, which is not nothing, but it's not much more than nothing. No one was hurt, but it scared the crap out of people. It reinforced people's fears, and it halted the growth of nuclear industry. And today, 3 Mile Island is considered like a cautionary tale. I don't know, of nuclear power or something. Anyway, it's the thing that probably hurt the nuclear industry for as much as anything in the United States. In July of 1979, Carter addressed the country for the 5th time about energy use. Now, he began with an explanation of why he believed the American economy was in crisis. He said it was a lack of moral and spiritual confidence. And Americans really didn't like that so much. It sounded like the president was trying to moralize them. A moral and spiritual confidence was the heart of America's inability to pull itself out of economic trouble. Like, if you just wanted it more, you could fix the economy. As if wanting it more is a measure of economic success. High inflation, oil shortages, government inefficiency, they had caused what he said was a crisis of confidence, and he claimed that American self-indulgence and material obsession had trumped spiritualism and community values. And President Carter might have a point, but it probably doesn't fit into an economic policy. He then gave his energy policy plans. It included conservation efforts, limited oil import quotas, and expanded energy from coal and biofuel and solar. At first, his speech seemed to resonate with the public, and his approval ratings went up. It was what's known as the malaise speech. It's a famous speech in presidential history. But at first, his speech resonated with the public, and his approval rating went up. But as people thought about it more, there was a lingering backlash that actually came around. People said, "Wait a minute, is Carter blaming the public for oil shortages? Maybe Carter hasn't paid attention to the fact that we are escalating tensions in the Middle East rather than talking them down, and you're blaming the United States for public oil shortages rather than looking for long-term solutions. Maybe it's not that we have cars; it's that energy programs by people like presidents of the United States are seriously misguided. And over time, the malaise speech, which at first people were like, yeah, maybe he's right, the longer it was, wait a minute, who's actually at fault here? That sets our scene for Roman numeral number 14, the rise of the religious right. Now, after declining from the peak years in the 1950s, Christianity, here we shift our topic from presidential history to cultural history. We'll get back to presidential history in a moment, but let's talk about what people are doing. Christianity had peaked in the 1950s. We had the 1950s conformist era. After the war, it seemed like that a proper American would just go to church. Well, Christianity was rising again in the 1970s. So it peaked in the 1950s, dropped in the 60s, but the 1970s, people were turning their eyes back heavenward. And that Christianity rise in the 1970s also got, I don't want to say tangled up with, but it coincided, maybe that's the best way to say it, coincided with the rise of conservatism as a cultural and then later political force. Evangelical Christians had been more and more alienated from the culture that seemed to trivialize religion and promote immorality. The counterculture of the 1960s became the culture of the 1970s. By the end of the 1970s, people were like, wait a minute, what in the world happened? And it kicked off a new religious revival. Religious revival of the 1970s used TV and radio to reach new people. Most notable, there was a number of notable evangelists at the time. They were tele-evangelists because they worked on television as their primary media. But a number of these televangelists, particularly notable, were Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell. Jerry Falwell started an organization known as the Moral Majority, an evangelical and fundamentalist Christian group who supported traditional morality and looked at cultural conservatism as the fundamental piece for it. The Equal Rights Amendment, here while we're talking about cultural development, let's talk about women's rights. The Equal Rights Amendment passed Congress in 1972. The Equal Rights Amendment was this banner here: equality of rights under the law will not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state in a court of sex. To its supporters, the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, guaranteed women's freedom in the public sphere. It was strongly supported by second-wave feminists, but even though it had been passed by Congress in 1972, it hadn't been ratified by the states by 1982 when the amendment expired. So it didn't pass. We don't have the ERA. It's not an amendment to the Constitution. To its foes, to the people against the ERA, freedom meant the freedom to follow tradition and the Equal Rights Amendment. The reason that it didn't pass, among the other reasons, were the arguments that that the ERA threatened to discredit the role of the wife and the mother. And the anti-ERA side was led by this woman here at the top left. Her name was Phyllis Schlafly. It was a conservative woman. And she led the charge against the ERA. Said, no, this is going to have long-term damage for the country. Rather than benefit. I think that is still a fair topic of discussion, and we're not going to get into it because we're frankly going to run out of time. But I think it is a fair debate as to whether or not the ERA would have been a net benefit for Americans or a net complication for it. As the ERA expired, a lot of women's groups began to focus more and more on getting women elected to public office. They said, okay, maybe we'll try to fix this by getting women brought into the greater public sphere. Notably, Geraldine Ferraro was the Democrats' vice presidential candidate in 1984, became the first woman on a major party ticket. She didn't win, partially because her running mate, the presidential candidate, was a deeply flawed candidate, but anyway. It wasn't until Ronald Reagan named 2 women to the cabinet. He named Sandra Day O'Connor as the first female justice of the Supreme Court, and did, I think, put some really important women into issues. We'll get there in a minute, though. First, we got to get back to Carter. Wages were rising, but the gains were offset by inflation. Those inflation gains also pushed people into higher tax bracket, so people actually bought homes with less money. So, or they brought home they didn't buy homes with less money. You can't, I don't know how you do that. They brought home less money. Okay, so here's the way it works. You have inflation, and the cost of living goes up. When there are periods of inflation, usually paychecks go up as well. Those things kind of go with it. And the hope is that the net standard of living doesn't change very much. But paychecks were going up in the 1970s to go keep up with the inflation. Remember, inflation sorting up to 14% a year. But inflation is going up, which means paychecks are going up, which means like, oh, look, I got a raise. But that also push people into a higher tax bracket, and they means they're paying a higher amount in taxes. But the reason that they got the wage raise was because the cost of living was going up, so they were just keeping up with cost of living adjustments. But then all of a sudden, they're taxed at a higher rate, and boom, in real dollars, and what you're actually bringing home was less, and that people felt kind of screwed by that, and I think naturally so. By 1980, spending on welfare entitlement programs was nearly $30 billion a year, and the high costs and stories of people like welfare queens, like Linda Taylor here, she's an interesting story, you can go look her up. There were people living rich lives, a fraud that soured public opinion, and people really turned against the role of welfare and public assistance. Stagnant real wages, runaway government spending, and inspired a conservative critique. The taxes were too high and government too large, and what are they spending their money on? People like Linda Taylor, who are living like a small queen on the public dole. That's where we get to the election of 1980. Ronald Reagan was a former actor. He was a movie actor. It's hard to call him a star. He was kind of a B-list actor. But still had acting chops and had spent his life on the screen. He had been a 2-term governor of California, largely considered a successful one. He had been introduced to the national stage in 1976 when he ran against Gerald Ford. He didn't win that nomination, but he did win nomination in 1980 to run against Carter. His running mate was a former director of the CIA, George H.W. Bush, and Ronald Reagan ran for president on very conservative issues. About that time, Supreme Court rulings on abortion, pornography, prayer in school, they had conservatives all riled up. Then you have the Iranian hostage crisis, where 60-plus U.S. citizens were being held in Iran. It seemed to show that Carter had an inability to negotiate and had probably actually made the situation worse. The economy had been weak since the 1960s. It was poor by 1980, and Reagan promised to rejuvenate the economy to do there. He was an extremely good candidate. His acting experience made him comfortable with cameras. He was relaxed and charming. He could read off a teleprompter effortlessly. He was referred to as the great communicator. He could take complicated issues and simplify them down into plain speak and gave clear answers. And Reagan was successful in the 1980 election. He carried 44 states in his victory over Jimmy Carter. That brings us to Roman numeral number 25. The Reagan Revolution. We'll begin with his economic program. It's probably the thing that is most strongly associated, or at least was, with Reagan at the time. His plan to reduce the size and influence of the federal government of the economy was often mocked as Reaganomics, to curtail unions, to dismantle regulation, to sharply reduce taxes. Reagan's tax cuts were a sharp retreat from the principle of progressivity, that the rich pay a higher percentage in taxes. He believed that high taxes discouraged people from reinvesting their money and from growing the economy. He cut programs like welfare and education. Not everything was cut in the Reagan administration. Social Security, veterans benefits, basic welfare, those pieces remained. They wouldn't be cut, but uh, they weren't really focused on anymore. Reagan did propose big increases in one part of the federal budget, and that was on the military. He doubled the Department of Defense, and it's in his first term in there. Now, the heart of the Reagan program was an economic plan called supply-side economics. Supply-side economics is a theory that says that if people paid less in taxes, they would save and spend more for themselves, and that would boost the economy on the consumer level. And so that's the theory of supply side economics, and he did so over 3 years. He reduced tax rates by 25%. Now, initially, it went terribly. What we're looking here, the change in the real gross domestic product, this is the size of the economy, and here we're real GDP means we're adjusting for inflation over time. And on average, this is what the GDP should be. And Reagan comes in office, and the first thing he did was hurt the economy. His promise of economic booms didn't play out, and initially produced the most severe recession since the 1930s. Over time, the national debt tripled, or it rippled, maybe that's tripled, I'm not sure what that typo is, to $2.7 trillion. By early 1983, consumer spending fueled an economic upturn, just like Reagan predicted. So by the time 1983 rolls around, the magic kicked in, and the economy soared. Tax cuts, lower interest rates, low inflation was exactly what Reagan had predicted, and exactly what the doctor ordered. Decreases in unemployment happened, and stock markets surged upwards. Then, in 1987, the stock market crashed, mostly due to a computerized trading system that was the 80s technology. There was a glitch. Anyway, this computerized trading, not a glitch, it's not, we're not going to get into it. It was computerized trading system was a problem. Stock market crashed in 1987. The next day, the economy recovered and didn't really stop. Now, supply side theory promised that even though taxes were lowered, you're lowering taxes, the economy would recover overall. And that would bring a larger tax base because more people are working and they're earning more money. And you could lower the tax rate, but actually bring in more taxes because the pool would get bigger. Like the percentage would be smaller, but the pool of money would be bigger, and you could actually bring in more tax dollars. And that was kind of supply side theory. Now, along with budget cuts, he thought that the deficit would be quickly erased. You cut the budget, you'll bring in more tax revenue as well, and we will whip this tax deficit in no time, and we will erase the federal debt over time. The economy did grow, and it's true. The economy did grow. It was a success, but spending continued to outstrip tax receipts, mostly because Reagan shoved a lot of money into the military, and he had no pretensions of cutting military spending as well. But Reagan raised taxes in 1982 to try to head that off, but not enough to balance the budget. Reagan's most important tax from reducing the size of government came not from cutting the budgets, but from deregulating the U.S. businesses. And these probably actually had a bigger impact on the overall economy. It didn't go super evenly. Let's talk about kind of the bumps on the road. The savings and loan industry is a particular type of banking which is used for buying houses. The savings and loan industry struggled with increasing interest rates and inflation since the 1970s. Housing just suffered. Bad interest rates and inflation was really hard on people who wanted to go buy a house. Reagan deregulated the savings and loan industry so that they could offer different financial services, cut back on their oversight, and try to make them more nimble and looser businesses. Saving and loans assets grew by over 50%, but that also came at the risk of making riskier loans, partly leading to a banking crisis in the 1980s, and had to take government bailouts, which cost taxpayers millions of dollars. Reagan did deregulate other businesses, and I think we had greater success in other places. He allowed airlines to have more competition and profitable air routes, and actually drove down the cost of airline travel. He used price controls on oil to stabilize the fuel supply, eliminated some things like inspections of nursing homes. The goal was there to make end-of-life care more affordable. It might have also made nursing homes kind of rat traps, but cheaper rat traps. He did little to stop the decline in manufacturing. Things like deindustrialization and the decline of unions had a devastating impact, particularly on minority workers. But Reagan seemed to be powerless to go stop the flight of jobs overseas in manufacturing. When the national unemployment climbed to 8.9% in 1981, that's bad. But in particular, the black workers, the African American segment of employees exceeded 20% unemployment, and that's pretty catastrophic levels. Subpoint C, education. In 1983, a report called A Nation at Risk claimed the United States students lagged behind other nations and that 23 million people were unable to follow simple instruction manuals or to fill out a job application. If 23 million Americans can't do some pretty fundamental tasks, the thought was that schools were bad, and it fits into our long national story of our inferiority complex of American education. The commission promoted greater emphasis on the basics, back to the basics: English, math, science, social studies, and computer science. It recommended, how about this, more homework, longer school days, and an extended school year. And I'm not kidding when I say that sounds awesome. I say that totally unironically. I've argued for those things for years. You're lucky I'm not in charge, I guess. In 1984, Reagan stood up for re-election. He faced off Walter Mondale. You'll remember 1984 was the time that nominated the Democrats have their first woman vice presidential candidate. She was the first woman to campaign on a major party ticket. Anyway, Walter Mondale was the presidential candidate. He was a largely unflashy, straightforward liberal, was pretty conventional. American Democratic liberal, probably could have made a good run in a lot of elections, but not against Reagan in 1984 once the economic magic had kicked in and you have a guy who is, the perfect cameraman president. Anyway, Reagan just crushed him. Crushed him. Mondale won one state, his home state. Yeesh. Roman numeral number 26. Ronald Reagan came into office and he was determined to end the Vietnam syndrome of widespread opposition to the use of troops abroad. Basically, Vietnam had gone badly and Americans felt burned about it and were not eager to get back into it. But he mostly used military aid rather than troops to pursue his foreign policy because troops are it's difficult and expensive. He proposed an entirely new strategy for dealing, in particular with the Soviet Union, called the Strategic Defense Initiative. It was mocked at the time and called it Star Wars, but it had the idea that you could be an ambitious plan to intercept and destroy enemy missiles. So if, like the Soviet Union was launching an intercontinental ballistic missile, then U.S. SDI satellites could pick it up and shoot a counter missile and hit that missile and blow it up before it ever threatens the United States. Blow it up while it's still in space. That was the Strategic Defense Initiative. Now, today, this is a plausible system, but with 1980s technology, it is totally implausible. The thing just won't work. It just wouldn't work with 1980s technology, and there was no way to do it. It did scare the Russians, though. It freaked them out. Because it destabilizes the principle of MAD, of mutually assured destruction. Suddenly, if one side can shoot the other missiles out of the sky, destruction is not mutually assured, and that freaked the Russians out, and they, to oversimplify the story, spent like crazy to try to build more missiles, because maybe they could launch more than the SDI could shoot out, and it bankrupted the Russian economy. And again, I'm oversimplifying the story here, but perhaps this is what ultimately took down the Soviet Union. In 1983, terrorists loyal to Iran took several Americans hostage in the country of Lebanon, and Reagan denounced the country of Iran for doing so. He urged U.S. allies to refuse to sell weapons to Iran in its long war with Iraq. But in 1986, it was discovered that Reagan approved arms sales to Iran in exchange for the release of hostages. The profits of those arms sales were diverted to Nicaragua to support the Contras, and the Contras were an anti-communist force there. It was illegal to do so, but this whole thing was being done under the rug with shadow money that didn't really exist. Now, Congress was scandalized by this and held joint hearings to get the bottom of it. The result was in several convictions. In 1982, George H.W. Bush pardoned several Reagan officials to go clear their name for it, but the Iran-Contra affair really did show some weaknesses in Reagan's understanding of foreign policy. He denied knowledge of any of the illegal proceedings, but the affair undermined confidence that he even controlled his own administration. There was this idea of plausible deniability. How much did Reagan know? How closely did he follow the details? I mean, this is a true story. Reagan did go take like a 90-minute nap every day in the middle of running the country. So people thought, like, how really in touch is he with details that his aides perhaps can run the Iran-Contra scandal under his nose and he doesn't know about it, or does he totally know about it and he's just denying it? We're not going to get into it. Subpoint C. In the Soviet Union in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the general secretary. It's basically president of the Soviet Union. He inherited a country in financial stress with inefficiency and recession. It turns out that communism is a really bad long-term economic plan. He adopted a policy of glasnost. That's a great Russian word. Glasnost is freedom of the press. It allowed some criticism of the government. It allowed for some freedoms that had never been allowed before in the strictly controlled communist country. So glasnost is freedom of press. About the same time, but just a little bit later, he announced another Russian word called perestroika. Perestroika is restructuring the country to allow for some private enterprise and an eventual move to democracy. Please keep those terms straight, though. Glasnost is about the press. Perestroika is about private enterprise and trying to capitalize the communist country. I don't have a good mnemonic device to keep those straight, so you're just going to have to do it the old-fashioned way with brute force memorization. The better U.S. and Soviet relations would allow the Soviet Unions to reduce military spending and reform the economy, and so Gorbachev began plans to try to build the bridge between the United States and the Soviet Union. He began arms control meetings, he tried to limit some classes of weapons and allow inspections of bases, and tried to smooth out things between the United States and the Soviet Union. He reduced Soviet control of Eastern Europe, hoping that democracy in those places could emerge, and the Soviet Union was ultimately no longer able to support them anyway. In late 1989, East Germany opened up the Berlin Wall. It allowed for free passage between the communist and free parts of the city for the first time in a generation. The wall was quickly torn down and reunited the two countries together, and basically ended the control of communism in Eastern Europe, not in the Soviet Union yet, but the satellite nations of Eastern Europe. This was the beginning of the end. Gorbachev's policies, although they were designed to bring stability to the Soviet Union, probably destabilized the country. It was maybe too much too fast, but maybe it was too little too late. Anyway, Gorbachev's policy was trying to bring stability, and it didn't. By 1991, 14 non-Russian republics declared their independence, and the Soviet Union was breaking up. Gorbachev was forced to resign, and the Soviet Union dissolved under his feet. It was replaced with the Russian Federation, or what would become the Russian Federation, led by Boris Yeltsin, this square-headed man in the middle of your screen. Roman numeral number 27. In 1988, President Reagan was term limited and was ready to hand over the reins. The Reagan era was the largest peacetime expansion of the U.S. economy in its history, and a lot of people, most people, contributed the growth to Reagan's policies. And in 1988, Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, ran for president and pretty much ran on the Reagan coattails. He promised to build on Reagan's legacy, promising read my lips, no new taxes, and loyalty to the conservative ideas of the moral majority. Now, George H.W. Bush himself was not a cultural conservative. He was an economic conservative, I suppose, but really kind of a cultural moderate. But he understood the power of the moral majority and didn't have a serious objection to them, so he decided to stick with those conservative ideas. They resonated very strongly with Reagan. Nevertheless, George H.W. Bush was able to adopt them as well. His 1988 campaign used very pointed attacks to characterize his opponent, Michael Dukakis, as a soft-on-crime liberal. Now, Michael Dukakis played right into it and kind of walked into this almost clownish pacifist piece. Anyway, right outside of the mainstream America, the negative campaign, it was a very negative campaign. George H.W. Bush ran really mean political ads. Might probably contribute to the lowest voter turnout since Calvin Coolidge in 1924. Only about half of American eligible voters went to the polls. If you want to look up for one example of that, you can look up what's called the Willie Horton ad, which is this YouTube link down here, but you can just put it in your tube and look up Willie Horton ad, you'll see it. Anyway, about half of Americans turned out. Bush received 53% of the popular vote and 40 states in a victory, which was seen as a conservative mandate and turning over the reins for the future. This will conclude our notes for the day. It concludes from period 8, and it concludes the last of the organized curriculum for AP US History. After this, we'll move to a different style of teaching to catch us up through period 9. But you may save and close your notes. Jesus saves, and so should you.